Welcome to Shattered Innocence by Shellia Beckett, a psychological fiction novel. Narrated by Charlotte Winsome. Copyright 2023 by brooksaudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No reproduction in any form without written permission from the publisher. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for a special free audiobook offer. Shattered Innocence by Shellia Beckett. Chapter 1. Want to go for a walk? Montraville asked his companion as they finished their meal. Or should we get a ride and head to Portsmouth? Belcourt preferred the walk, so they strolled out to explore the town and casually observe the people returning from church. Montraville was an army lieutenant, and Belcourt was his fellow officer. They had visited their friends before departing for America and were now heading back to Portsmouth, where the troops were waiting for embarkation orders. They had stopped in Chichester for lunch, and knowing they had enough time to reach Portsmouth before dark and still take a walk, they decided to check out the Chichester ladies as they came back from church on Sunday afternoon. They satisfied their curiosity and were about to head back to the inn without paying any particular attention to the young ladies when Madame Dupont and her school group emerged from the church. The sight of so much youth and innocence naturally caught the young soldiers' attention. They paused and instinctively doffed their hats as the group passed by. Montraville noticed a tall and elegant girl who looked at him and blushed. He instantly recognized Valerie Temple, whom he had seen and danced with at a ball in Portsmouth when she was only 13. Now, 2 years later, her appearance had changed remarkably, and her blush of recognition stirred new and pleasant thoughts in him. He couldn't help but think that her pleasure at seeing him again might have caused the emotion he witnessed, and this vanity in him made him desire to see her again. "She's the loveliest girl," he remarked as they returned to the inn. Belcourt looked at him, intrigued. "Did you not see her?" Montraville continued. "She was wearing a blue hat, and her beautiful eyes of the same color have managed to make me feel incredibly strange in my heart." "Oh, come on," said Belcourt. "A bullet from our American friends could make you feel even worse in less than 2 months." "I never think about the future," replied Montraville, "but I am determined to make the most of the present. I would gladly make a deal with any helpful person who could tell me who the girl is and how I could possibly meet her." However, since no helpful person appeared at that moment, and the carriage they had requested arrived at the door, Montraville and his companion had to say goodbye to Chichester and its charming resident and continue on their journey. But Valerie had made such a strong impression on his mind that it wasn't easily forgotten. After spending 3 whole days thinking about her and trying to come up with a plan to see her, he decided to set off for Chichester and rely on luck to either support or thwart his intentions. When he reached the outskirts of the town, he got off his horse and sent the servant ahead with the horses. He then made his way toward the location where the beautiful Valerie Temple's mansion stood amidst a vast garden. Montraville leaned on a broken gate and gazed intensely at the house. The surrounding wall was tall, and perhaps the guards protecting the precious fruit within were more vigilant than the legendary ones of the past. "This is quite a romantic endeavor," he said to himself. "Even if I succeed in seeing and talking to her, it won't lead to anything good. I have to leave England in a few days and may never return. So why should I try to win the affections of this lovely girl, only to leave her with countless worries that she is unaware of at the moment? I will go back to Portsmouth and not think about her any more," Montraville declared. The evening had now come to an end. A peaceful calm filled the air, and the pure queen of the night, with her silver crescent, faintly illuminated the sky. The tranquility of the surroundings brought a sense of calmness to Montraville's mind. "I will not dwell on her any longer," he stated, intending to leave the place. However, as he turned, he noticed the gate to the pleasure grounds open, and 2 women emerged, walking arm in arm across the field. I will at least find out who they are, he decided. He caught up to them and, greeting them with the customary pleasantries of the evening, requested permission to accompany them to the busier parts of town. His delight was immeasurable when, awaiting a response, he recognized Valerie Temple's face hidden beneath a large hat. He quickly managed to establish rapport with her companion, a French instructor at the school. Before parting ways, he discreetly placed a letter he had intentionally written into Valerie's hand, along with $5 into Mademoiselle's hand. She promised to make an effort to bring Valerie back to the field the following evening. Chapter 2. Mr. Temple was the youngest son of a nobleman whose wealth was far from sufficient to match the ancientness, magnificence, and, I must say, arrogance of the family. He witnessed his older brother being utterly unhappy after marrying an unpleasant woman whose wealth aided in upholding the declining prestige of the household. Moreover, he observed his sisters being legally sold off to elderly, feeble men whose titles bestowed them with importance in society's view and whose wealth made them remarkably wretched. "I won't sacrifice my internal happiness for appearances," he said. "I will seek contentment, and if I find it in a humble cottage, I will embrace it with the same warmth as if I were seated on a throne." Mr. Temple owned a small estate worth about $500 per year. With that, he decided to maintain his independence, marry Bassett on his heart's desires, and keep his expenses within his income. He had a compassionate heart, always ready to help those in need and share his blessings. Known as a friend to the unfortunate, he was often sought for advice and assistance. He would also actively seek out deserving individuals in poverty and uplift them from obscurity, all while keeping his own expenses minimal. "You're a kind-hearted person," a young officer once told him. "I want to give you an opportunity to demonstrate your goodness." "There's nothing that would please me more," Temple replied. "Please show me how I can be of service to my fellow human beings." "Well then," said the young man, "let's go visit someone who doesn't have a deserving living situation. If it weren't for the angel by his side, comforting and supporting him, he would have succumbed to his misfortunes long ago." The young man's emotions overwhelmed him, and Temple, not wanting to further upset him, followed in silence until they reached the Fleet prison. The officer inquired about Captain Robinson, and a person led them up several flights of dirty stairs. Pointing to a door that led to a small and miserable room, the person said it was the captain's quarters and left. The officer, named Blakeney, knocked on the door and was told to come in by a soft and melodious voice. He opened the door and was amazed by what he saw, which held his attention. The room, although small and showing signs of poverty, was extremely tidy. Sitting in an armchair, his head resting on his hand, his eyes fixed on an open book in front of him, was an old man wearing a lieutenant's uniform. The uniform, although worn, would be more likely to shame those who overlook true merit rather than embarrass the one wearing it. Beside him sat a beautiful person, engrossed in painting a fan mount. She was fair-skinned like a lily, but sadness had faded the blush in her cheeks before it fully bloomed. Her eyes were blue, and her light brown hair was modestly tied back under a simple muslin cap with a black ribbon. She wore a white cotton dress and a plain cotton handkerchief, completing her attire. In this modest outfit, she was even more captivating to someone like Temple's heart than if she were adorned with the grandeur of a glamorous socialite. When they entered, the old man stood up from his seat and warmly shook Blakeney's hand, offering Temple his chair. With only 3 seats in the room, the old man calmly sat on the edge of his small bed. "This is an unusual place," he said to Temple, "to host distinguished visitors, but we must adjust our expectations to our circumstances. I am not ashamed to admit why I am here, so why should I be embarrassed about my situation? Our misfortunes are not our faults. If it weren't for that poor girl—" Here, the philosopher was overcome by the role of a father. He quickly stood up from his seat and walked toward the window, wiping away a tear that he was afraid would stain the cheek of a sailor. Temple glanced at Miss Robinson. A clear drop had escaped from her eyes and fallen onto a rose she was painting. It smudged and discolored the flower. The thought that went through his mind was how symbolic it was that the rose of youth and health fades quickly when watered by the tears of sorrow. "My friend Blakeney," he said, addressing the old man, "told me I could help you, so please, dear sir, kindly tell me how I can ease the worries in your heart and enhance my own pleasures." "Young man," Robinson replied, "you have no idea what you're offering. While I am deprived of my freedom, I cannot be free from concern for myself, but that's a minor worry. My anxious thoughts extend to someone dearer to me than life itself. I am an old and feeble man, and in a few years I expect to fade into obscurity and silence. But when I am gone, who will protect that innocent blossom from the harsh winds of adversity or the cruel hand of disrespect and dishonor?" "Oh, father!" exclaimed Miss Robinson, gently holding his hand. "Do not worry about that. Every day I pray to heaven that our lives will end at the same moment and that we will be laid to rest together. For why should I live when I am deprived of my only friend?" Temple was deeply moved, even to tears. "You will both live for many years," he reassured them, "and I hope you will experience much happiness. Stay strong, my friend, stay strong. These temporary hardships will only make the bright moments of prosperity even more delightful. But we're running out of time. You could have already told me who your creditors are, what they're demanding, and other details that are necessary for your release." "My story is short," Mr. Robinson said, "but there are some details that will painfully haunt me to remember. However, since you appear to be a sincere and selfless friend, I will recount every circumstance that led to my current, distressing situation. But my child," he continued, addressing his daughter, "let me persuade you to take this opportunity, while my friends are here, to enjoy some fresh air and exercise. Go, my love, leave me now. Tomorrow, at your usual time, I will expect you." Miss Robinson planted a filial kiss on his cheek and complied. Chapter 3. "My life," said Mr. Robinson, "up until recently, was unremarkable. I became a sailor at a young age and have served my country with an unwavering passion for many years. When I was 25, I married a wonderful woman. We had a son and the young lady who just left us. My son was talented and spirited. I made sacrifices to provide him with a quality education, and his rapid progress in his studies more than made up for the financial strain. He attended a school where he befriended Mr. Lewis, a wealthy young man. As they grew older, their friendship deepened, and they became inseparable companions. Scott chose to become a soldier. I lacked the connections and funds to secure him a commission, and I had hoped he would pursue a career at sea. However, this went against his desires, and I stopped pressuring him on the matter. The friendship between Lewis and my son was so close that he had unrestricted access to our family. He presented himself in such a convincing manner that we didn't hesitate to share with him all the little challenges we faced regarding Scott's future plans. He listened attentively and offered to provide any necessary funds for his initial endeavors. I eagerly accepted the offer and gave him a promissory note for the payment. However, He didn't want me to specify a particular deadline, as he said I could repay him whenever it was most convenient for me. Around the same time, my dear Danielle returned from school, and I soon began to suspect that Louis had romantic feelings for her. I warned my child to be cautious of him and to consider her mother as her ally. She was genuinely innocent and, when I suspected that Louis was expressing his love for her, she confided in us, assuring us that her heart remained unbiased towards him and that she would willingly follow our guidance. I took the opportunity to question him about his intentions toward my child, but he gave a vague response, leading me to banish him from our home. The following day, he sent a demand for repayment of his money. Unfortunately, I was unable to fulfill the request. I pleaded for 3 days to try and raise the funds, deciding to mortgage my retirement pay and rely on a small annuity that my wife possessed, rather than be indebted to such a worthless man. However, I was not given this brief period of time. That evening, as I sat down for supper, completely unaware of any danger, an officer entered and forcefully separated me from my loved ones. My wife had been in a declining state of health for quite some time. The sudden and inevitable ruin was a blow she was not prepared for, and I witnessed her fainting into the arms of our servant as I left my own home for the bleak walls of a jail. My poor Danielle, overwhelmed with fear for both of us, collapsed onto the floor and tried to hold on to me with her feeble efforts, but in vain. They pried her arms open, she screamed and fell down. But forgive me. The horrors of that night unsettle me. I cannot continue. He stood up from his chair and paced back and forth across the room several times. Finally regaining some composure, he exclaimed, "What a mere child I am! Why, sir, I have never felt like this even in the midst of battle." "No," said Temple, "but a truly brave soul is acutely aware of human emotions." "True," replied the old man, a hint of satisfaction crossing his face. "And even though these feelings are painful, I would not trade them for the numbness that the Stoic confuses with philosophy. How many exquisite joys would I have overlooked if not for these intense sensations, this quick perception of happiness or misery? So let us, my friend, accept life as it is presented to us, tempered by the hand of a wise providence. Let us be grateful for the good, patient in the face of the bad, and not dare to question why the latter prevails." "This is true wisdom," said Temple. "It is the only way to come to terms with the unfortunate events in life," he replied. "But I digress. I will no longer impose on your patience and will continue with my sorrowful tale. On the very evening I was taken to prison, my son arrived from Ireland, where he had been stationed with his regiment for some time. From the concerned expressions of his mother and sister, he learned who had arrested me, and, even though it was late, he quickly went to the home of his deceitful friend, filled with wounded affection, and asked earnestly for an explanation of this cruel behavior. With the demeanor of a calculated villain, he confessed his love for Danielle. He claimed that her social standing prevented him from marrying her, but offered to set me free immediately and provide for her if Scott could convince her to live, as he impiously put it, a life of honor. Enraged by the insult against a man and a soldier, my son struck the scoundrel, and a duel ensued. Afterward, he went to a nearby cafe and wrote me a long, affectionate letter, blaming himself deeply for introducing Louis into the family and allowing him to do us a favor that ultimately brought us to ruin. He pleaded with me not to let regret or useless sorrow over his fate worsen the anguish in my heart, which he feared was already unbearable. I received this letter early in the morning. It would be futile to try and describe my emotions upon reading it, Suffice it to say that a merciful providence intervened, and I was unconscious of the almost unbearable miseries for 3 weeks. A fever and intense delirium took hold of me, and my life was considered hopeless. Eventually, my exhausted body succumbed to the healing power of sleep, and several hours of peaceful slumber restored my sanity, although the extreme weakness of my physical condition prevented me from feeling my distress as intensely as I otherwise would have. The first thing that caught my attention upon waking up was Danielle sitting next to my bed. Her pale face and black outfit prevented me from asking about poor Scott. The letter he had sent me was the first thing that came to mind. Gradually, the rest of my memories came back. I remembered being arrested, but I couldn't figure out how I ended up in this room, where they had taken me while I was sick. I was so weak that I could hardly speak. I squeezed Danielle's hand and looked around the room, hoping to see someone else dear to me. "Where is your mother?" I asked, weakly. The poor girl couldn't answer. She shook her head silently, and then she threw herself onto the bed, wrapped her arms around me, and started crying. "Both gone?" I asked. "Both of them," she replied, trying to hold back her emotions. "But I'm sure they're happy." At this point, Mr. Robinson paused. The memory of the scene was too painful for him to continue. Chapter 4. "It took me a few days," Mr. Robinson continued, regaining his composure, "before I could gather the details of what had occurred while I was ill. Eventually, I mustered the courage to ask my beloved daughter how long her mother and brother had passed away. She informed me that the morning after my arrest, Scott returned home early to inquire about his mother's well-being. He stayed for only a few minutes and appeared greatly disturbed upon leaving, but urged them to remain hopeful. Approximately 2 hours later, as they were having breakfast and trying to devise a plan for my release, they heard a loud knock on the door. Danielle rushed to open it and was met with the sight of her bleeding brother being carried in by 2 men. They had transported him on a stretcher from the location where he had been engaged in combat. Her poor mother, weakened by illness and the struggles of the previous night, was not able to handle this shock. Struggling to breathe, her appearance dishevelled, she made her way to the room where they had taken her dying son. She knelt by the bedside and, holding his cold hand, she uttered, "My dear boy, I refuse to be separated from you, husband and son, both lost at once. Merciful Father, spare me." She succumbed to a severe convulsion and passed away approximately 2 hours later. Meanwhile, a doctor had attended to Scott's injuries, but they were in such a condition that there was no hope for recovery. He remained unconscious from the moment he was brought home and died that evening in his sister's arms. Even though it was late when this occurred, my daughter Danielle insisted on coming to me. "How must he feel?" she pondered, at our apparent neglect. "And how can I inform him of the hardships that heaven has bestowed upon us?" She entrusted the care of the departed loved ones to some kind neighbours who had come to provide comfort and assistance, and upon entering the house where I was confined, she found me in the aforementioned situation. I do not know how she managed to stay strong during these challenging moments. Undoubtedly, heaven was by her side, and her determination to preserve the life of one parent somewhat lessened her grief for the loss of the other. My circumstances were extremely difficult, with very few acquaintances, none of whom were capable of helping me. After my wife and son were laid to rest, my creditors seized my home and belongings. However, as their value was insufficient to settle all my debts, I was faced with legal action. No friend came forward to aid me. Following her mother's burial, my beloved Danielle accompanied her nearly dying father to this sombre place. We have been here for almost a year and a half. I have relinquished my part-time income to settle my debts, and my child supports me through her work, sometimes through intricate sewing, sometimes through painting. She leaves me every night and stays at a lodging near the bridge, but returns in the morning to uplift me with her smiles and bless me with her dutiful affection. A lady once offered her refuge in her family, but she refused to leave me. We are everything to each other, she said. I am grateful that I have the health and energy to develop the talents that nature has bestowed upon me, and I trust that if I utilize them to support my beloved parent, I will not be seen as an unproductive servant. As long as he lives, I pray for the strength to continue my work. And when it pleases heaven to take one of us, may it grant the remaining one the ability to bear the separation as we should. Until then, I will never abandon him. But where is this heartless persecutor? Temple asked. He has been abroad since then, the old man replied. But he has instructed his lawyer to never release the debt until every penny is paid. And how much do you owe in total? Temple inquired. £500, he answered. Temple was taken aback. It was more than he expected. But we must do something. That kind-hearted girl should not waste her life in confinement. I will visit you again tomorrow, my friend, he said, shaking Robinson's hand. Remain hopeful. Just as light and shadow are harmoniously blended, so too are the joys and sorrows of life. The horrors of one only serve to enhance the brilliance of the other. You have never lost a wife and son, Robinson remarked. No, he replied, but I can empathize with those who have. Robinson squeezed his hand as they approached the door, and they parted in silence. When they exited the prison walls, Temple expressed his gratitude to his friend Blakeney for introducing him to such an admirable person. He mentioned that he had a specific commitment in the city and bid him a good evening. And what should be done for this distressed man? Temple pondered as he walked up Ludgate Hill. I wish I had a fortune that would allow me to immediately pay off his debt. How wonderful it would be to witness Danielle's expressive eyes filled with joy for her father's release and gratitude for his saviour. But is my wealth not abundant, even excessive, compared to Robinson's extreme poverty? What have I done to deserve comfort and abundance while a brave and honourable officer starves in a prison? $300 a year should surely be enough for all my needs and desires. In any case, Robinson must be assisted. When the heart is determined, the hands can quickly find a way to perform a good deed. Temple, being a young man with passionate emotions and lacking worldly experience, had not yet become hardened by the deceit and hypocrisy of the world. He sympathized with their suffering, overlooked their flaws, believed that every person possessed the same generosity as himself, and would gladly share his last dollar with an unfortunate fellow human being. It is no surprise, then, that without waiting for the cautious advice of prudence, Temple resolved to raise enough money to help Robinson by mortgaging a portion of his wealth. We need not delve too deeply into the motives that drove him in this instance. It is enough to say that he immediately put his plan into action. Within 3 days of first encountering the unfortunate lieutenant, Temple experienced the utmost joy of witnessing him regain his freedom and receiving heartfelt thanks and tears from the grateful Danielle. "And tell me, young man," said his father to him one morning, "what are your intentions in visiting that old man and his daughter so frequently?" Temple was unsure how to respond. He had never asked himself that question before. He hesitated, and his father continued, "It was only recently that I learned how your acquaintance with them began, and I cannot imagine any reason other than your attachment to the daughter that would drive you to such reckless lengths for the father. It must surely be her charm that enticed you to risk a portion of your fortune." "Charm, sir," exclaimed Temple eagerly. "Danielle Robinson is as genuine as she is devoid of any other flaws. She is—" "Everything kind and delightful," his father interrupted ironically. "Undoubtedly, in your opinion, she is a role model for all women to follow. But tell me, sir, what are your intentions towards this paragon? I hope you don't plan on compounding your foolishness by marrying her. If my fortune were enough to support her according to her worth, I can't think of a woman better suited to ensure happiness in marriage." "Then, my dear boy," said his father, "since your social status and wealth fall far short of what your princess might expect, please consider directing your attention to Miss Douglas instead. She, with her modest estate of 3,000 a year, is more on your level, and her father recently sought the great honor of your alliance. I will leave you to ponder this offer, and please remember that your union with Miss Douglas will enable you to be more generously supportive of Danielle Robinson." The elderly gentleman exited the room with an air of dignity, leaving Temple in a state of astonishment, disdain, and fury. Chapter 5. Miss Douglas was the sole offspring of a wealthy man, almost idolized by her parents, flattered by her dependents, and never contradicted even by those who called themselves her friends. That's how Miss Douglas was. Her appearance was as beautiful as nature itself could make it, but her mind lacked cultivation, her heart lacked empathy, her passions were impulsive, and her mind was almost overwhelmed with flattery, indulgence, and pleasure. This was the girl who, thanks to a biased grandfather, inherited a substantial fortune and became its mistress. She had seen Temple frequently and, believing she could never be happy without him and never considering the possibility of him refusing a girl as beautiful and wealthy as herself, she convinced her doting father to propose an alliance to the elderly Earl of D., Mr. Temple's father. The Earl accepted the proposal graciously, thinking it a great match for Connor, and being too fashionable to consider a wife as any hindrance to the friendship he professed for Robinson and his daughter. Unfortunately for Temple, he held a completely different opinion. The conversation he had just had with his father revealed the true state of his heart, and he realized that no amount of wealth would bring him happiness unless he shared it with Danielle Robinson. Knowing the purity of her feelings and the integrity of his own heart, he recoiled at the idea his father had suggested, marrying a woman solely to use her fortune to support the woman to whom his heart truly belonged. Therefore, he decided to reject Miss Douglas and, regardless of the outcome, offer his heart and hand to Danielle Robinson. Filled with this resolve, he confronted his father, declared his decision, and was ordered never to set foot in his presence again. Temple bowed. His heart was too overwhelmed to allow him to speak. He left the house hastily, and hurried to share the cause of his sorrows with his dear old friend and his lovely daughter. Meanwhile, the Earl, deeply bothered that such a fortune could be lost, decided to present himself as a candidate for Miss Douglas's affection. What incredible transformations are brought about by that reigning force, ambition! The lovesick girl, upon hearing of Temple's rejection, cried, raged, pulled at her hair, and vowed to use her wealth to establish a Protestant convent, and by becoming the abbess, she would isolate herself from the sight of cruel and ungrateful men forever. Her father was a worldly man. He allowed this initial outburst to subside, and then calmly revealed to her the proposals of the old Earl, emphasizing the numerous advantages that come with a lofty title, describing in vivid detail the surprise and vexation that Temple would experience upon seeing her as a countess and his mother-in-law, and imploring her to carefully consider before making any hasty vows. The distressed young woman dried her tears, listened patiently, and eventually declared that she believed the most effective way to avenge the insult from the son would be to accept the favor. So she said, so she did, and within a few days she became the Countess D. Temple heard the news with emotion. He had lost his father's approval by confessing his love for Danielle, and now he realized there was no hope of regaining it. "But he won't make me unhappy," he said. "Danielle and I have no ambitious desires. We can live on 300 a year for a little while until the loan is paid off, and then we'll have enough not only for the necessities, but many of the small luxuries of life. We're going to buy a cozy little house, Danielle," he said, "and there we'll go with your respected father to retire. We'll forget about all the fancy, extravagant, and wasteful things. We'll have some cows, and you'll be the queen of the dairy. In the morning, while I tend to my garden, you'll take a basket on your arm and go out to feed your poultry. And as they flutter around you, grateful for your care, your father will enjoy his pipe in a charming alcove, and as he sees the peace in your face, he'll feel such genuine joy that he'll forget he was ever unhappy." Danielle smiled, and Temple saw that it was a smile of approval. He looked for and found a cottage that suited his preferences. With love and marriage as their companions, the happy trio retired there, enjoying many years of uninterrupted happiness, never desiring anything beyond the limits of their own home. Plenty and Prudence, her assistant, presided over their meals. Hospitality welcomed guests at their doorstep. Peace brought smiles to everyone's faces. Contentment filled their hearts, and love and health brought comfort. These were the parents of Valerie Temple, their only child, who, at the request of a close friend, was allowed to continue her education that her mother had started at Madame Dupont's school, where we first introduced her to the reader. Chapter 6. Madame Dupont was a woman perfectly suited to oversee the upbringing of young women, if that responsibility fell solely on her. However, it was impractical to manage a large school without the aid of suitable assistants. Unfortunately, these assistants were not always the type of individuals whose behavior and values were in line with what respectable and sophisticated parents would desire their daughters to emulate. Among the teachers at Madame Dupont's school, there was Mademoiselle Laroue, who possessed not only a pleasing appearance and charming demeanour, but also a well-rounded education and the refined manners of a lady.